Hello, friends. This is Dr. Chris Curry speaking on behalf of the Alternative Realist. It's early February 2019. There's been a lot of controversy lately about toxic masculinity. A lot of this was triggered by a Gillette commercial that aired January 13th, 2019, that went by the title of "We Believe the Best Men Can Be." And it's about toxic masculinity. And let me try to clarify some issues here. A lot of people look at that commercial and they react negatively to it. A lot of people look at the commercial and act positively to it. My concern is for those who act negatively to it. It seems to me that they're not making the proper distinctions. There's two distinctions that have to be made when it comes to toxic masculinity. And those who are reacting against the commercial don't really understand this, it seems to me. If we have a spectrum, one end of the spectrum says one thing, the other end of the spectrum says the opposite. And in between, on the spectrum, there's many different positions. At one end of the spectrum on masculinity, we have toxic masculinity, unhealthy masculinity, bad masculinity. And then over on the other end of the spectrum, we have healthy masculinity. So if there's a criticism against toxic masculinity, people should not conflate that, confuse that with all masculinity. If I criticize toxic masculinity, I'm not criticizing healthy masculinity. Now, so far in this debate, everybody seems to be getting into it. Jordan Peterson has gotten into it. Greg Gutfeld from Fox News has gotten into it. Ben Shapiro has gotten into it. Seems to me that most of these guys have a very confused position on the issue. If they are actually endorsing toxic masculinity, if they say toxic masculinity is healthy masculinity, which it seems that they're doing by being against that commercial's main message, its main message is against toxic masculinity and how men need to hold men accountable. And if a guy is acting like an ass in front of a woman, no matter what color the guy is, white, black, Asian, Mexican, it doesn't matter what his ethnicity is, what his race is. He should be told to cool it by some other guy. Men need to hold men accountable. That's one of the messages in the commercial. It's a good message. It's one that we should endorse. But these guys who are opposed to the commercial seem to be conflating toxic masculinity with all masculinity. Those who criticize the commercial are really confusing toxic masculinity with healthy masculinity. It's kind of interesting. Out of all the commentators that I've seen on YouTube making comments about the Gillette commercial, one of the only persons who makes sense is Whoopi Goldberg. Now, I don't normally agree with Whoopi Goldberg on anything, but on this issue, she had it clear. She had it more rational than phony conservatives who conflate, who confuse toxic masculinity with healthy masculinity. Whoopi Goldberg made the distinction. It's a key distinction to make between healthy masculinity at one end of the spectrum and toxic masculinity at the other end of the spectrum. And there's many points in between. Some people can be toxically masculine to a certain degree. They don't have to be maximally, they could be partially toxic in their behavior. Well, Whoopi Goldberg on The View on January 15th did get it right. she made the distinction. One of the conservative commentators on the show was confusing it all. Oh, if you criticize masculinity at all, you can't criticize any form of masculinity. If you criticize toxic masculinity, that's equivalent to criticizing all forms of masculinity. And it just seems to me that that position is rationally unjustifiable. You cannot justify it psychologically, logically, morally, or philosophically. It's a bad position to take. It's an irrational position to take. Now, some of the people who criticize the commercial say that they criticize it because it looks to them as if it's white men who are being criticized, that the bad guys are white men. White men are the ones who are acting like asses in front of women, the ones who are starting fights and acting immaturely. They're acting like people affected by toxic masculinity. So they think that the commercial is sort of racist, that one of the underlying messages is that toxic masculinity is bad and the only people who have it are white males. I don't think that that's true, but if that's your view, you can hold to it. I don't think that that's what the commercial is getting at. I think the commercial is getting at toxic masculinity is bad no matter what your race is. So there are definitely some white folks, some white males who suffer from toxic masculinity. You'd be stupid not to say that. You would be divorced from reality not to admit that. But there are men who suffer from toxic masculinity of every race, like I mentioned before. They can be Mexicans, Hispanics, of any kind. They can be black. They can be, if you want to get into different ethnicities, they could be Irish or Jewish. It doesn't matter. They can be from any ethnic background, any racial background, or any combination of ethnicities or races. That's the point. I think that's the point of the commercial. If the commercial is trying to make a subtle dig, make a subtle subliminary message that only white guys can suffer from toxic masculinity, then the commercial's wrong. And I would blast it as quickly as anybody else. But let's face it, that's not really what the commercial's about. Okay, to the extent that that's what it's saying, we blast it. To the extent that it's just saying males have to be careful not to go into toxic masculinity. It's a disease, it's an illness, it's a philosophical problem, it's a moral problem, it's a psychological problem, it's a logical problem. If you suffer from toxic masculinity, if you're a male suffering from toxic masculinity, you need to have a resolution to your problem. You need to overcome that problem. I don't care what race you are. Okay, so the first big problem with people who we could call phony conservatives, who are utterly offended by the Gillette commercial, first big problem that they have is not making a distinction, not making a proper distinction between toxic masculinity and healthy masculinity. One is unhealthy and irrational. It's a disease. It's a logical, philosophical, moral disease. It's a problem. So distinguishing between healthy masculinity and toxic masculinity. Key distinction to make in this debate, in this controversy, in this discussion. If you don't make that distinction, you're just going to be howling at the moon. Your position is not going to be worth listening to. That's the first distinction that has to be made. Now, according to what I consider to be a phony conservative narrative, which says we have to blame the women's movement, blame feminism, for all masculine problems these days. It seems to me that that is also a problem that the phony conservatives have with their position. We have to make a distinction, just like we made a distinction between toxic masculinity and healthy masculinity. We have to make the same kind of distinction when it comes to feminism. There's toxic feminism and there's healthy feminism, and all kinds of positions in between. Don't confuse, don't make a hasty generalization and say all feminism is alike. And don't commit the fallacy of hasty generalization as saying that all masculinity is alike. No, it isn't. Some forms of masculinity are toxic and some are healthy, and there's all the positions in between. Likewise, by analogy, the same goes with feminism. You have healthy feminism over here, and you have toxic feminism over here. What would be an example of healthy feminism? Healthy feminism would be the women's movement, which was trying to gain rights for women, legitimate rights, like the right to vote, the right to hold public office, the right to go to school, the right to own property in the woman's own name, the right to work at various occupations, the right to engage in self-defense. Very important. These are very important for women. The right to drive. All these kinds of things. These are legitimate rights that women should have. The right to be a teacher. These are all good rights that women should have. And those rights did not come easy. When you study the women's movement, there was a lot of male resistance. The plutocratic oligarchs who run society, mostly male, if not exclusively, did not want to give women any rights. Women had to struggle for it. They had to fight for it. Some males did wind up getting converted to their position and fought alongside them and helped bring about all these different kinds of rights that women now have. It was not an easy fight. It was not an easy war, not an easy battle. But feminists won it. So, we need to distinguish, when it comes to feminism, between healthy feminism, which stood up for those rights that I just mentioned. I must have mentioned 7 of them at least. And if I left any out, sorry for doing so. It's great that women have rights. I think a woman's right to self-defense is excellent. We need to have women who are protected. The more rights that women have, the more protected they're going to be. Take away their rights, the more vulnerable they're going to be, the less protected they're going to be. They need to be protected. If you're a guy who's confident in his masculinity, if you're chivalrous, you have no problem. You're not threatened in the least by women's rights. You want women to have rights. But then there's toxic feminism. Toxic feminism, it seems to me, can be reduced to 2 positions. The 2 most toxic claims that are made by toxic feminists are, 1, that it's good for girls and women to be sluts. That's toxic feminism. That is the worst position they could possibly advocate. And yet there are some who do advocate it. That it is good for girls and women to be sluts. That's the worst claim, the most toxic of all the claims that toxic feminists can make. Not all feminists make that. Remember, we're saying that there is healthy feminism. Healthy feminists would stand against that. Healthy feminism is against toxic feminism, just like healthy masculinity is against toxic masculinity. So in my talk today, obviously, I'm against toxic masculinity, which should be against toxic masculinity as much, if not more, than against toxic feminism. Although that one claim from toxic feminism that it is good for women, for girls and women to be sluts, that's a bad one. That is really bad. That's evil. That's evil, friends. Cannot endorse that. The second claim, number two, the number two claim, toxic claim made by toxic feminists, is that the most oppressive group of people standing against women are white males. White males. And they could even add white Christian males. That these are the most oppressive, this is the most oppressive group of people against women. So that's toxic claim number two. Toxic claim number two from the toxic feminist is white males are the most oppressive group against women. All we got to do to refute that is look at history. Look at where things stand today. There are not any white Christians that I know of that exist now or that have ever existed for 2,000 years who have engaged in acts like female circumcision, clitoridectomies. And yet there are Indians who do this, and a lot of Muslims who do it, and Africans who do it. You look at the record. In what area of the world do women have the most rights? Think about it. Is it in Africa? Is it in Asia? Is it in Brazil? Let me give you a subtle hint. No. It's in the white Christian world. It's in Europe and European-based nations like Canada, England, Australia, New Zealand. So the record speaks for itself. Who is it that would want you to think that white Christian males are the most oppressive group of women, when in fact, if you study history carefully, you're going to find out that it's just the opposite. Just the opposite is true. It's not my purpose to go into the history of it right now. My purpose is just to deal with that Gillette commercial and toxic masculinity. So both of those toxic feminist claims we can easily refute. They're both immoral and illogical, philosophically problematic positions. Remember, for toxic feminism, it's number one, it's good for all girls and women to be sluts, and two, that the most oppressive group against women are white Christian males. Yeah, we can refute that. The second one. The first one is just immoral on the face of it and irrational on the face of it. So the phony conservatives who are out there who reacted negatively to, I think there's real conservatives, there's a spectrum of conservatives. There's phony conservatives at one end, then there's real conservatives, cultural conservatives at the other end. And cultural conservatives are not necessarily economic conservatives. And we'll get into that issue in one of the future talks. And so I don't want to get carried away on that point right now. But there's real cultural conservatives, who I said are not necessarily economic conservatives, and they're sure as heck not, I'll tell you this right now, they're sure as heck not libertarian capitalists. If you're a cultural conservative, you cannot be a libertarian capitalist. The two are totally antithetical to one another. We'll go into that, another talk. And there's phony conservatives and all the positions in between. So the phony conservatives are fallacious in their thinking because they don't make a distinction between toxic masculinity and healthy masculinity. They make a hasty generalization, regard all forms of masculinity as the same. So if you attack toxic masculinity, you're ipso facto, by that very fact, attacking healthy masculinity. And that's phony. That's illogical. That's the fallacy of hasty generalization. And then the phony conservatives confuse toxic feminism with healthy feminism. They confuse the two. So they look at those two claims that I mentioned that are made by toxic feminists, and then they claim all feminists make that claim. And that's just not true. Healthy feminists blast the toxic feminists, just like healthy masculine people blast toxic masculine people, like what I'm doing right now. So by lumping all feminists together in one group, and by saying that feminism is the problem of masculinity today, the phony conservatives are guilty of these three fallacies. Hasty generalization, saying that all feminists are the same, which is just complete baloney. If you have a girlfriend who has rights, a mother, a daughter, a sister who has rights, you have to be thankful to feminism, healthy feminism, because they would not have those rights without the women's movement and without feminism. You need to be thankful to healthy feminism. If you're a good guy, if you're a masculine guy, be thankful for healthy feminism. Don't lump it all together. So hasty generalization says all feminists belong together in one group. They all agree with each other. They're all toxic. That's nonsense. It's just like saying all masculinists belong together. Everyone who's masculine belongs together in one group. They're all healthy. No, they're not all healthy masculine. There's a huge chunk of the American population and the population in the West these days. A huge amount of the male population suffers from toxic masculinity. I'm not going to give a percentage right now, but it's up there. Is it 50%? Maybe. Is it more than 50%? In some context, let me tell you, in some context, it's way more than 50%. If you're looking at the gang context and some of the so-called macho white guy context, the phony macho white guy context, guys who have bumper stickers trying to show how macho they are, how masculine they are, they don't have any masculinity whatsoever. They're in search of masculinity. They're neurotic. We'll go to that in a minute. So the first logical fallacy committed by toxic, masculine, phony conservative males is hasty generalization. 2 is reductionism. All the problems of masculinity are traceable back to feminism. The fallacy of reductionism occurs whenever an arguer tries to reduce all the different causes involved in a problem just back to one cause. They say all those causes come together in one cause. So every single masculine problem, these phony conservatives say, is traceable back to feminism. It's irrational. Guys are responsible for their own problems with masculinity. No women's movement is going to make some guy who's truly masculine lose his masculinity. It ain't going to happen. If you're masculine and you know it, toxic feminism is not going to take away your masculinity. It can't do it. It can't be done. So these phony conservatives who say that it can be done have committed the fallacy of reductionism. It can't be done. If you're masculine, toxic feminists cannot take it away from you. They can't take away your masculinity. And if you complain about it, it's probably because you didn't have any masculinity to begin with. That's usually the case. The third fallacy committed by the phony conservatives who suffer from toxic masculinity is projecting the blame. Instead of blaming themselves for not being masculine, they blame the feminist movement. And like I said, from a psychological point of view, from a moral point of view, you can't do that. This is the fallacy of projecting the blame. It's an ego defense mechanism that is used in a neurotic way. This is a neurotic ego defense mechanism. When you project the blame and say, I'm not responsible, don't hold me responsible for the evil that I have done. That's a problem. So we have three fallacies committed by the phony conservative, toxic masculine group of people. And so their position is irrational. Now think about this. Think about some guy who claims to be macho or who's trying to be masculine. Notice how guys who are not sure of their masculinity and who are in a neurotic search for masculinity, they suffer from NSM, that these guys will try to find their masculinity by grasping at straws, by smoking cigars. Oh, I smoke cigars, therefore I'm masculine. Well, women can do that too. And if you think that you're a macho heterosexual because you smoke cigars, well, there's gay guys and women who smoke cigars. So smoking cigars is not a necessary or sufficient condition, logically speaking, for being masculine. Smoking cigars isn't going to do it for you. Or watching football, or watching boxing. Those are not going to do it for you. Or joining the Marines, or joining the football team. You can think of a whole list of things that some guy who's in desperate search for masculinity to try to convince himself that he's a heterosexual and that he's masculine, what they might do, the lengths to which they might go. They may think, oh, if I go to auto races, if I go watch truck and tractor pulls, that this will make me masculine. That will prove to me that I'm heterosexual. Listen to me. If you're a heterosexual and you're masculine, you don't have to prove it by watching football, by playing football, by joining the Marines, by looking at truck and tractor pulls, smoking cigars. None of that's going to make it. You have to deal with your issue. If you're trying to prove to yourself and to others that you're a heterosexual and that you're masculine by doing those things, then that should already tell you that you are in the neurotic search right there. You're suffering from a neurosis. Depending on how bad it is, it could even be a psychosis. Some of the talks that we will be giving deal with psychological issues. We deal with philosophical issues, issues in Western civilization, issues in religion, and even theology. We deal with all that. So I'm not going to go into it in much depth right now because we're still trying to deal with the Gillette commercial and the people who oppose the Gillette commercial, who I have now described as phony conservatives who suffer from toxic masculinity themselves. Those are the only people complaining about that commercial when it comes down to it. So these guys who claim that they're already tough, that it's those other people who've had their masculinity threatened and whose masculinity is defective in comparison with them. Well, if that's true, check this out. Now, this is from a psychological point of view. Why would those guys be complaining about this commercial? If you know that you're a heterosexual, if you know that you're masculine, that commercial isn't going to bug you. In fact, you'll like that commercial. The very fact that you don't like it should tell you something about your own heterosexuality and your masculinity. That goes for Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, Greg Gutfeld, the rest of them. You know, we could do a psychological analysis of these guys. So a guy who's not threatened in his masculinity and heterosexuality is not going to make a big statement against the Gillette commercial. He's going to like the Gillette commercial. Because why? Because he's masculine and he doesn't like toxic masculinity. Guys who suffer from toxic masculinity. A guy who suffers from toxic masculinity is the kind of guy who makes asinine statements to women, who acts like an ass in front of women, thinking that, oh, I got to be macho. It makes me masculine if I do cat calls, if I whistle, if I make what we would call vulgar remarks to women. The vulgar remarks show how tough I am, shows that I'm heterosexual. No, it doesn't. It shows that you're probably gay and you're hiding it. You're trying to convince yourself that you're masculine. Because if you're really masculine, you don't have to do any of that crap. Only asses would do that. Only guys who suffer from toxic masculinity, phony masculinity would do that. So usually toxic masculinity is demonstrated in a male's behavior toward women. Cat calls, committing rape, that's toxic masculinity, whether it's aggravated rape, statutory rape, any kind of rape. A guy who's masculine doesn't do that, doesn't need to do it, doesn't do it, cannot do it because he doesn't want to. He doesn't want to be toxic. Toxic males do it. Another example of toxic male behavior, toxic masculinity, is these guys who walk up behind other guys and just slug them. Boom. It's a cheap shot. It's assault. It could even be aggravated assault. It's also a crime. It's immoral. But there are guys who do that. That's why people who are opposed to the Gillette commercial seem to be embracing toxic masculinity. If you oppose the Gillette commercial, then you oppose what it opposes. Or sorry, you embrace what it opposes. The Gillette commercial opposes toxic masculinity, so if you oppose the Gillette commercial, you embrace toxic masculinity. So you're comfortable with males committing rape, with males making asses of themselves in front of women, being vulgar. You think that's cool. It ain't cool. Men have to hold men accountable. It's not cool. So these guys who claim that, oh, I'm not affected by the feminist movement, but these other guys who have defective masculinity are, and yet they complain about the Gillette commercial, that means that they themselves are affected negatively in their masculinity. They themselves who claim that, oh, I'm above the fray. No, they're not above the fray if they're complaining about the Gillette commercial. They're not above the fray. They're right in it. So the guys who claim not to be affected by the feminist movement, who claim not to be, and yet they complain about it, you can see that they are. It's one thing to be offended by toxic feminism, for the 2 points that I mentioned. We should be opposed to those 2 things. Everybody, any guy from any race, any ethnic group should be opposed to those 2 points from toxic feminism. But we should embrace healthy feminism for all the rights that it's given women, all the rights that it's given your mother and your daughters and your sisters and your girlfriends and the women that you know, your teachers, your students. You have the feminist movement to thank for that, the healthy feminist movement, not the toxic feminist movement, that's for sure. So, from a psychological point of view, then, we see that the phony conservatives who suffer from toxic masculinity are showing themselves to be toxic in their masculinity by reacting so negatively against the Gillette commercial. And by that very fact, ipso facto, by that very fact, embracing toxic masculinity, acting so offended and so threatened by the Gillette commercial. Well, if you're masculine, you're not going to be threatened by the Gillette commercial. It's not going to affect your heterosexuality. You can watch the Gillette commercial all day long, and if you're a heterosexual, you're still going to be one at the end of the day. But you have some of these guys, these phony conservatives, complaining to such an extent it sounds like they're so offended by the Gillette commercial. They sound like the very people that they're trying to avoid being like. They wind up sounding like crybabies. Now, I don't know. How can you have women, girls, thinking that their boyfriend, their husband, their father is masculine if he's complaining like a crybaby about the Gillette commercial? He's showing that he is not masculine by the very fact that he's complaining about the Gillette commercial. Say, oh, I'm so threatened by the Gillette commercial. We have to be like Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro and speak out against the Gillette commercial. If you're comfortable in your masculinity and your heterosexuality, you don't have to complain about the Gillette commercial. So you women, maybe instead of thinking that your guy is so cool because he complains about the Gillette commercial, maybe you better do a rethink about the guy. Maybe he's not as masculine as you thought he was. Maybe he's in search of masculinity, and he ain't got it yet because he's threatened by a mere commercial. A wee little commercial is enough to upset him and threaten his masculinity. Well, think again. Yeah, probably, as I study things, as I observe the situation, as a professor for most of my life, being involved, I'm involved in rigorous sports too, myself, but they don't make me masculine because there's women involved in them too. Martial arts. I see very few men who are comfortable in their own skin, but you can't blame the feminist movement for it. There's something wrong with the male psyche these days. There's very few men who are chivalrous and knightly, who have a high view of women. We need to have a high view of women. That doesn't mean that you respect every single woman for her own behavior. We shouldn't respect women who are criminals. You shouldn't respect sluts for their sluthood. But you can respect women, womanhood in general, for what women have been in the past and what they have the potential of being, and what many of them are now. Many women are dignified now. They have a dignity. A lot of women don't live up to their dignity. And the toxic feminist movement doesn't want them to live up to their dignity. But neither do toxic guys who suffer from toxic masculinity. They don't want women to be dignified. Toxic males want women to be sluts too. They're just as bad as the feminists, the toxic feminists. Toxic masculinity and toxic feminism go together. They go together. On the other hand, healthy, on the other side of the spectrum, healthy masculinity and healthy feminism go together. Interesting, isn't it? That's the way that it should be. We got to fight to keep it that way. Those of you who are challenged by the Gillette commercial, and you think of yourself as a conservative, I would challenge you to listen to what I've said in this talk. Go back and listen to the fallacies that I've mentioned, the psychological issues that I've mentioned. Go over it again. And I think you'll see that the points that I've made to help clarify this discussion, this controversy, are correct. No brag, just fact. I think you'll find that to be the case. I hope you will find that to be the case. I'm not done talking about these kinds of issues. We're going to continue talking about these issues as time goes on, give various talks. I probably have left out some important points. I'm sure that I have. We'll try to get those points at some point in the future, so stay tuned. If you like what you see, I'm trying to tell it like it is. I am telling it like it is. If you like what you see and you want to hear more, please give us a thumbs up and please subscribe. This is Dr. Curry for The Alternative Realist. Once again, trying to set the record straight. Okay, thank you. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.